Hello, and a big warm welcome to the Guardian Doula's Diary podcast. My name is Angela Deuce, or Angie. I'm your host and the founder of Guardian Doula. I'm a certified birth and postpartum doula and childbirth educator based on Sydney's Northern Beaches and serving women and their families all throughout Sydney. This podcast is an honest collection of the stories and experiences of birthing women and the professionals that support them to empower, equip, and inspire us all. Let's get into it. Hello, welcome back. Here we are again for another episode. Today we're going to be talking about something that I am so passionate about and that does my head in because it's such a common misconception, and it is a misconception that costs women big time in their births. And that is this idea that you cannot control your birth. And that it's all out of your hands. You may as well just put nothing in place. You may as well not have a birth plan. You may as well not even think about what your hopes are for birth, because it is so wildly out of your control that there's just no point. And that could not be further from the truth. If you look at things like the birth trauma inquiry, this mindset is a huge part of why the birth trauma rate in Australia is so high. It's because it's a complicated thing and there's a lot of factors that go into it. But I think this mindset of whatever happens, happens, that mindset causes big issues for women in the birth space. So I want to explain to you today, just 10 of the things that you can control about your birth and about how your birth goes. And these 10 things are, I'm literally just hitting the tip of the iceberg. There is so much more that you can do, so much more that you can put in place. And I obviously don't have the capacity to go into every single one of them or, even to go into these 10 in a lot of depth. But I am going to touch on just 10, and I'm going to hopefully change your mind a little bit around how much control you actually do have over your birth, because you have a lot. And absolutely, yes, there are a number of things that you can't control. There are certain complications that may come up. There are certain, depending on the model of care that you're in, you may not be able to control who is on shift on the day of your birth. You may not be able to control how much traffic there is on the way to the hospital. You can't control the time that you go into labor. Unless you're going to go and have a medical induction. There are things that are outside of our control, and I'm not denying that. But I think we emphasize those things that we don't have control over way too much, and we completely forget that there's also a heck of a lot that you can control. So without further ado, let's get into these things. And I do want to say that if you listen to this podcast and you go, oh my goodness, there's so much more about birth that, I didn't realize that I had control over. Or if I'm saying these 10 things and you're like, gosh, I can't think of any more that I can possibly control, or any things that I could possibly be doing in addition to these 10, then this workshop that I'm about to do is for you. I am releasing a workshop really soon. It's going to be a live workshop that's happening on the 21st of November from 7:30 to 8:30 p.m. Sydney time. And if you are not from Sydney, or if you really want to attend the workshop but you can't make that time, it will be recorded, so you can still buy a ticket and access everything, whenever it suits you. But this workshop is, I've named it How to Have an All-Natural Empowering Birth. That's the name of the workshop, and the reason that I've named it that is because I am asked daily, and how can I have an empowering all-natural birth in this world and in this system where birth has been so over-medicalized? Intervention is at an all-time high, and, women are not having the births of their dreams. So if you listen to this and you're like, oh my gosh, I need to know more, definitely attend the workshop. You can even get a VIP ticket, which will give you access to a live Q&A directly after the actual training. And in that Q&A, you can pick my brain. You can ask me any questions that you have that are specific to your situation. You can also listen to me answer everybody else's questions. I feel like that is something that people get so much out of. Oftentimes when someone else asks a question, you kind of go, oh gosh, I actually was wondering about that too. Or maybe I wasn't wondering about that, but now I'm wondering, like I didn't even think of that, but yes, I need to be thinking about this. So that workshop is going to be incredible, whether you are planning to fall pregnant or whether you are 40 weeks pregnant or like somewhere in the middle. This workshop is going to be hugely valuable. And then also something, that I should have mentioned is that the VIP ticket holders will also be getting a workbook that's going to have tons of resources, lots of extra information, birth prep activities, all sorts of things. So hop onto my website and get your ticket. Today, the day that this episode goes up, is the last day for the early bird price. So this episode is going up on Monday. And after Monday, the prices will go up to the full price and you can no longer get that early bird deal. So make sure that if you're keen, you get your ticket like right now. Pause this podcast, go and get your ticket so that you don't forget. And come back, because there's nothing worse than missing an early bird sale. I hate doing that. So make sure you don't do that. All of that said, let's get into the 10 of the many things that you can control about your birth. Number 1, you can control who your care provider is. I cannot emphasize this enough. Your model of care is so important. And again, I'm going to be going into this in a lot more depth in that workshop. But if you are a healthy woman and you're hoping to have a natural birth, which pretty much everyone who comes to me is, and you are someone who is healthy, you don't have any complications with your pregnancy, there is absolutely no reason that you need to be seen by an obstetrician. There is just no reason for it. A lot of women think, oh, I'll go for an obstetrician because they are like more qualified, so they must be the better option for my pregnancy care. It's just not true. The stats show very clearly that obstetrician-led care leads to far higher rates of intervention. Obstetricians are not experts in normal vaginal physiological birth. That's not their scope. Obstetricians are trained to manage like highly complex, highly risky pregnancies. And essentially, like, an obstetrician is a surgeon. And I don't know about you, but if I'm hoping for a natural birth, I would rather be looked after by somebody who is an expert in natural birth, and that is midwives. So if you are someone who is healthy and you don't have a complicated, highly risky pregnancy, get the heck out of obstetrician-led care if you are hoping for a natural birth. Second thing that I always say is that where you give birth is something that you absolutely need to be intentional about. So similar to the obstetrician versus midwife phenomenon, if you give birth in hospital, the stats show that you are more likely to have interventions and that you are more likely to have actually adverse outcomes. If you are healthy, low risk, no pregnancy complications, most likely the safest place for you to give birth is at home. And that is contrary to popular belief. I know most people think that home birth is this hellishly dangerous, ridiculous thing. But really, if you take the time to do some proper research, you'll see that home birth for most women is actually safer and a very, very ideal option, particularly if you are hoping to have an all-natural birth. There is so much that I could say about that, but I'm going to leave it there. If you want to know more, if you want to have statistics on this, if you want to hear in a lot more detail, then be sure to come to the workshop. The third thing is whether or not you hire a doula. Now, I know that I absolutely drive this point home every time I talk about this, and that is because the research shows that doulas improve birth outcomes, and that if you are hoping for a natural birth, one of the best things that you can do is hire a doula. And I'm going to really quickly nut out a list of the benefits of working with a doula. And again, as always, references go out to my email list. When I send you the link for the podcast every week, if you're on my email list and you get that email, you will also get an attachment that has all of the references for what I share in the episodes. So if you would like those references, be sure to be on the email list. I am so big on evidence. I never say things just because it's what I've heard or because it's what I think. Like, I don't preach things at you unless they are evidence-based and I can provide a good, solid reference for what I'm saying. And this is no different. So let's quickly go over the list. These are the benefits Doula support shows a 50% reduction in the rate of cesarean sections, 25% shorter labours, 60% reduction in epidural requests, 40% reduction in the use of synthetic oxytocin. So that is the drug that is used to induce labour, and also it's the drug that's given to you after you give birth to your baby. Oftentimes women will have an injection to make the placenta come out, and that is synthetic oxytocin. It is not the same as the normal oxytocin hormone that your body produces. Do not believe that if that's what your care provider is telling you. They are literally blatantly lying. They are completely different chemicals, but that's a thing for another day. Doulas result in fewer birth complications, higher APGAR scores. So an APGAR score is a measure of the baby's condition post-birth. So a better APGAR score just means that the baby kind of is in better nick after they come out. Babies are 4 times less likely to have low birth weight issues. There is a 40% reduction in the use of instrumental delivery, so things like forceps and vacuum extractions. Women who have doulas have improved breastfeeding outcomes, decreased incidences of postpartum depression, better mother and infant bonding and interaction, reduced need for clinical procedures overall throughout the birth process. Also, women who had doulas had earlier onset of lactogenesis, which just means milk production and secretion. Mothers were less likely to rate their childbirth experience negatively. And also, there was a 30% reduction in analgesia use. So that's speaking about pain relief overall. So those are some pretty hectic benefits to having a doula. And I think you'd be pretty crazy to give birth without one. I have done it before and I do not recommend it. I've had 4 babies. So I think this is something that I can speak from experience. I really don't recommend that you do it. Whether you're giving birth at home or in the hospital, you need a doula. And I have an episode that is called, I think it's called Why You're Wrong About Doulas. And in that episode, I debunk the idea that you only need a doula if you're giving birth in hospital, or the idea that you only need a doula if you're having a home birth. Both of those are not true. It doesn't matter where you're giving birth, you need a doula. And I explain why in that episode. So check that out if you're interested. I mean, I just think there's so much to be said for advocacy. There's so much to be said for the information that your doula will provide for you. There's so much to be said for the benefits of like optimal maternal positioning in labor. Your doula has seen birth, they know birth, they trust birth, they really understand birth, and they are so well equipped to guide you through the whole process and to keep you calm, to keep you informed. So hire a doula. Do not skimp on that. I mean, people invest $50,000 in their wedding day and then they don't want to hire a doula for like $3,000-$4,000. I just think that's madness. People don't end up traumatized after they get married, but 1 in 3 women do end up traumatized after they give birth. So why do we not invest in the right things that are going to prevent that? It just makes no sense. Anyway, I digress. Number 4 is we can control how well we educate ourselves and where we are getting our information from. Okay, I could talk about this one forever. This is literally why I'm doing this workshop in the first place. The amount of misinformation that is out there is absolutely insane. There is crazy misinformation on Instagram, on TikTok, on Facebook, on Google. There is misinformation coming from midwives. Like sometimes I speak to midwives and they are spitting things at me that I'm like, that is literally the furthest thing from what the evidence says, and it's so concerning that you're telling people this. There's also misinformation that comes from what our mums and aunties and uncles and cousins and friends say, and they go, oh, you know, I had to have a cesarean because XYZ. And I'm like, oh my gosh. Such a common one is like, oh, you know, the baby's cord was around their neck in one of my scans. So, you know, I had to have a cesarean. Thank goodness for that. It saved my baby's life. Not true. Misinformation. The cord around the neck in the vast majority of cases is absolutely normal and the furthest thing from an emergency. So that's just one very tiny example. But I think where you get your information is hugely, hugely important. My tips on this is that you never get your information from a hospital antenatal class only. I have sat through a couple of those. Every single one that I have sat through it and literally just heard hospital policy, and it's been more about like, oh, this is what we want you to do when you're in labor and these are our policies, please adhere to them, more so than they are about like, this is how birth works, this is how you can optimize the process, these are the stages of labor and what your body needs in each stage, this is what your partner can do, this is how you can advocate for yourself. This is how to get really good information. This is how you can prepare your body for birth. This is how you can navigate the pain, the intensity. Like, that stuff so often is lacking in hospital-run birth classes, and it's just a really unfortunate reality. I have literally not sat through one hospital birth class where I thought, wow, that was such solid information. Women who do this course are going to be so well equipped, and they are just going to absolutely smash their birth. They now know everything they need. It's been the opposite. I've walked out, honestly, like, angry and so sad and discouraged, because I'm like, if this is all these women are getting and they now think, great, tick, I've like gotten informed, oh, I'm so informed now, like I know what to expect. There's so much missing from what most hospital birth courses will give you. So come to my workshop. There are so many really, really amazing places that you can get solid birth education from, and I just think if you do yourself one favor when it comes to your birth education, just don't do it through the hospital. Like, you have to pay for it anyway, so you may as well pay someone who's going to give you unbiased, really good information instead of just having a whole bunch of policies recited to you. Which, like, can I also just say, a lot of those policies are not even based on evidence, right? Because we know that oftentimes it takes up to 17 years for evidence to then become hospital policy. So a lot of the policies that they're probably going to be like lecturing you about, or I mean, at least in the courses that I have attended and the ones that my clients have told me about, you're being told about policies that, are not evidence-based and that are not there for your best interest. Maybe they make life easier for your care provider, but they likely don't make your life easier or better or your birth better. So be very, very, very careful where you get your information from. The next thing is that you can control how much you are preparing for birth, how consistently you're preparing for birth, and what you are doing to prepare for birth. Again, plug to the workshop. We're going to be talking about birth preparation and all of the things that I teach my clients to be doing in the lead up to their birth. There is a whole big fat list of things that you can be doing. Some things I think are like more important than others. And so we'll be unpacking all of that. But I think it's such a lie to be going into birth like, oh, it's not something that you can prepare for. It's not a test you can study for. It's not a marathon that you can train for. It absolutely is. There are things that you need to know before you go into your birth, and there are things that you need to be doing before you go into your birth. And if you do those things, and if you learn those things, you will absolutely have a better experience. I have seen it in the clients that I've supported. I have lived it in my own 4 experiences of giving birth, and the research proves it, right? Like, knowledge is power, but so is preparation. So be very mindful about what you are doing to prepare for birth, and also what you're not doing is important too. Number 6, you can also control how much you practice advocating for yourself. This one is huge, especially if you're going to go against my advice where I talked about hiring a doula. If you are expecting to be your own advocate, or you're expecting that your partner is going to be advocating for you, first of all, like, that's a terrible idea. Please don't do it. But if you are genuinely in a place where you're like, we just can't afford to hire a doula, it's absolutely out of the question. We can't, save up for it. We can't do a payment plan. We can't ask for contributions towards doula support instead of freaking 10,000 onesies and muslins that you'll never use. Like, if that is your situation, then at the very least, please, 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 I cannot emphasize enough, you need to be practicing just advocating for yourself throughout your pregnancy. And this looks like asking questions during your midwife appointments, or if you are having a high risk pregnancy and you do need to be seen by an obstetrician, then, in those appointments, in those sessions, practice asking questions, practice challenging things, being like, why are you suggesting this? What are my other options? What impact is this going to have on my birthing options? Questions like that. And there are certain questions that you absolutely need to have in your back pocket. We are going to go over them in the workshop, but knowing what questions to ask is a really, really important piece of the advocacy puzzle. But I think practicing advocating yourself, even if you do have a doula, the best thing that you can do is to also be practicing this. Like, it's all extra little things that go a very, very long way. So yeah, that's number 6. You can control how much you advocate for yourself. And I think practicing throughout your pregnancy is a very, very helpful thing that can make a big difference on the day. Number 7, you can also control who is present at your birth, right? A lot of the time I'll have women ask me like, should I invite my mom? Would that be really special? Should I have my sister there? Should I have my whoever? My advice is always to be very, very, very careful about who you invite into your birth space. This goes for like being careful about which doula you hire. I know that in point 3, I massively emphasized you need a doula. Do not skimp on this. Like, make sure that you have a doula. But I mean, I think now that we're getting into point 7 about how we can control who is present at our birth, I will call out that getting the right doula is super important. And, you know, same as making a decision around like, is your mum going to be there? Is your sister going to be there? The people that are going to be around you when you're giving birth are going to have a really, really big impact on how that whole process goes. The reason for this is that the people that are around you are like ultimately influencing the dynamic, you know, they're setting a tone. And depending on the tone or the dynamic in the room, that is going to directly and very significantly impact on your mentality, your like emotional state, your level of comfort as well. Like, if you wouldn't get naked and do a poo in front of this person, they shouldn't be at your birth. And I mean, that might sound a little bit extreme, but if you think about it, it really isn't that extreme. When you're giving birth, you are likely going to be naked and, you know, you'll be probably pushing really hard. Most women do poo when they're pushing their babies out. So if you're in doubt, maybe sit there and think like, would I do a poo naked in front of this person and like scream and groan and sweat and make all sorts of primal noises and whatever birth may bring for you. If you have any little sliver of like, oh my gosh, I cannot even imagine myself being in that situation and being comfortable in that situation, then if in doubt, leave them out. That's what I say. Like, you need to be careful about who you have at your birth. So many times I have heard stories of people, you know, oh, I want my mum there, and then mum comes to the birth and she sabotages it. Like, sometimes people bring their own agenda. Sometimes maybe the mum doesn't want to see you in pain and she starts pushing for you to have an epidural that you didn't really want, you know, or maybe the mum or the friend, maybe it's the opposite. Maybe they're not pushing you necessarily to have all these interventions or get the epidural or don't yell or whatever. Maybe it goes a different way. Maybe they are like a huge people pleaser and they're trying to please everyone, right? So they know that you don't want the epidural, so they would never like overstep that boundary. Oh no, my mum would never overstep that boundary. She's a huge people pleaser. She's really lovely. She would never push something on me. Well, if she's a huge people pleaser, if the healthcare workers are going to be pushing something that you're not comfortable with, is she going to then try and please them and like create this weird dynamic? Like, I don't know. There's so many ways that this can go, and there's so many ways that I have seen this go awfully wrong. So I think just be very careful, because you definitely don't want weird energy. You don't want to feel uncomfortable. You don't want any conflicting opinions. You don't want any controlling personalities in there. You just need to be very careful. And I think, yeah, you are your birth team. I love that saying that's like, you are what you eat. I feel like when it comes to birth, you are your birth team. And you really, like, your birth tends to go either really well or not so well, depending on who you have around you, supporting you, guiding you through the process. So be really careful about who is there. That is a big one that you can control, and it's a big one that I encourage you to take control of. Number 8, you can control how you handle early labor. So something that I really, really commonly see is that women, there's a few mistakes you can make, and we're going to talk about these in the workshop in depth and at length, just to name a couple of them. And like, obviously this isn't all of them because I don't have time, but number 1, you can control how much you rest during early labor. It's very common that people just get excited and they go, oh my gosh, I'm going to try and make my contractions stronger. I hear that all the time. It's the worst thing that you can do. Do not do that. When you are in early labor, you need to be conserving your energy. You need to be resting. You need to be staying hydrated, staying nourished, making your contractions stronger, and going and climbing stairs and doing squats. It's like such a bad idea. Don't do that. The other thing I think that's important about early labor is not advertising to the whole world that you're in early labor. Another mistake that I see is that women will do this and they'll start having contractions and then they text the family group chat and they call all their friends and they call their nana and they flip and tell their neighbors and they're like, oh my gosh, I think I'm going into labor. And what that can do is invite a whole lot of opinions, questions, requests for updates. And then there's a whole lot of attention on you, a whole lot of pressure, a whole lot of like, is the baby here yet? Is it intense yet? How are things progressing? How are you going? Are your contractions getting stronger? Are they close together? Like that pressure and that whole being analyzed thing is going to do you absolutely no favors when you're in labor. So be really careful about how you advertise that. That's just two little things that I think you need to be really mindful of. So how you handle your early labor is really important and it can set the tone for the rest of your experience. Number 9, if you are giving birth in the hospital, you can control how early you go in. Another massively common mistake is going into the hospital way too early. And I think this is just another reason to have a doula so that you don't make this mistake, because 9 out of 10 times women do go to the hospital way too early because labor is intense, even early labor. I hear all the time like, oh, I'm just going to labor at home for as long as possible. I'm going to do my whole early labor at home, even like as much of my active labor as possible. But it's very rare that that actually happens, because I think when people think in their head like, oh, I'm going to do early labor at home, I'm going to do kind of the beginning of active labor at home, and I'm only going to go in when things are really intense. But yeah, early labor is still labor. It's still intense when it's early, and so it's very easy to fall into the trap of being like, yep, this is super intense. We must be really close to having a baby. Let's go into the hospital. But then you get there and you still have so far to go. You're only at the start, and then you just open yourself up to a huge cascade of intervention that could have been very easily avoided. And I think like there's so many things that feed into this cascade of intervention. One of the things, like in the hospital's defense, is that imagine if you show up in early labor and it's a really busy day on that labor and delivery ward, and they have got an influx of women having their babies and they need the room. Obviously, they're going to be very tempted to offer you things like Syntocinon to speed your labor up, right? Or they are going to be more likely to say, hey, let's just break your waters. That'll make things go a bit quicker. All of these interventions can be horrendously unhelpful if you are hoping for a natural birth. And it is usually a cascade. So if you kind of say yes to one thing, it's very common that there's a bit of a domino effect that happens. So you want to be careful of saying yes to things that are not medically warranted. Like obviously if the baby's in distress or, something happens, then that is different and then that would be medically warranted. But speeding labor up because, it's a little bit busy today and we kind of just need this room for someone else, like that is not a medically indicated phenomenon. That is just like the ward's busy and logistically it's hard for us to care for you right now because there's 1,000 other women trying to have their baby. So had you stayed home until the very last second possible, that could have been avoided. And there are so many other things that I could say about this. This is just one tiny example that you can absolutely control how early you go into the hospital. Just because you've started having contractions and now you can't talk through them and you're breathing through them and you're like really in discomfort doesn't mean that it's time to go to the hospital. Just because your waters break doesn't mean it's time to go to the hospital. Just because you lose your mucus plug, it doesn't mean it's time to go to the hospital. I think like honestly, this probably needs to be a whole separate podcast episode in itself because there is so much to be said for getting this timing right. But I think my biggest advice and my number one tip is hire a doula to take the guesswork out of it. Now, the last thing that I'll go over, number 10, this is one of the most important ones to really wrap your head around. And this is one that I am going to be really unpacking in my workshop because I think it is so crucial. And that is you can control what interventions, screenings, tests, procedures, policies you consent to accepting or participating in. And this is massive, okay? If we kind of think back about how I mentioned before about the domino effect of this cascade of intervention where like you do one thing and then there tends to be a domino effect, that is why it's so important to be very mindful of what you consent to. And I think there's also so much to be said for informed consent. True informed consent is very important and it is very rare. it is illegal for your healthcare providers to do anything to you, whether that is administer a medication, perform a procedure, whether that's like a cervical exam, breaking of your waters, doing a stretch and sweep. All of these things are interventions that they have to give you an opportunity to give true, full informed consent, but it very rarely happens. Oftentimes they'll give you like some of the picture and they'll say, hey, we recommend that we break your waters because XYZ, but they have not explained to you what the risks are. They've not explained to you what the alternatives are. And they've also not explained to you the likely impact or like flow-on effect that would have on your birth options and your birth progress and your outcomes that are likely to occur after that. But we'll be unpacking this like point 10 about what interventions and tests and procedures you consent to and like have done to you during your pregnancy and during your labor and birth. Like it's all connected and they all can have a really big impact. And again, I am absolutely not anti-intervention. Like sometimes these things are totally warranted. I always, use the example of like my little baby, my fourth baby, literally lived in hospital for the first few months of her life, and she needed medical intervention, right? She was born with like really significant medical complications, and so she was in serious need of some serious intervention. So I'm absolutely not against intervention when it is warranted, but what I am against is women not being given the full picture, number one. I'm also against women being coerced, which happens far more often than you might think, and I'm against women just being told that like, oh, what I'm gonna do is, or yeah, so what's going to happen is like that language is not giving you the control that you legally have and that you legally should be given. Anyway, all that to say, like you just need to be really educated and really informed about what the common interventions are, what the common like tests and screenings are, what the evidence says about those things. Because again, just because it's hospital policy does not mean that it is evidence-based. So you need to be really, really mindful. And again, like there are so many more things than those 10 that you can do to really help have the best possible birth experience and to have the best outcomes. But that is just 10 quick things that you can do to control your birth. 10 things that you do have control over. And yeah, I think these are really important things that you do take control over, because there is this truth that some of birth is outside of your control. You can't control when you go into labor, or like whether your water breaks and then you don't have contractions for 48 to 72 hours. Like these things we can't control, okay? But if let's say this happens to you and you are in a model of care that aligns with what your hopes are for birth. Let's say you have hired a doula, so you've got someone advocating for you. You've got someone who is giving you really solid information. You've got someone who is able to help you remember the right questions to ask in the heat of the moment, and when push comes to shove. Let's say you have been really well educated. You've come to the workshop, right? And you've learned about all of these interventions and the effect that they have and what the research says and blah, blah, blah. You've controlled who is present at your birth and what dynamic they're setting. You've controlled like how you've prepared for birth and how consistent you've been with your birth preparation. When you add this stuff together, it is a perfect storm for a really great birth experience. And I think you would be crazy to not do these things that you can do if you want to have a great birth. And I don't think there's anyone out there who is pregnant who doesn't want to have a great birth, right? You'd have to be out of your mind to not want to have a great birth. It's like one of the most beautiful rites of passage that we have as women. So yeah, like make it count, get it right. Like let's do it well, I want you to love your birth. I want you to look back on your birth and be like, wow, that was one of the best, most incredible experiences of my life. And nothing could have prepared me for how empowering and how life-changingly crazy that was. Like that is what I want for you. And if you want that for yourself, then yay, you are in the right place, because this is what I do. This is my bread and butter. I help women absolutely love their births. I've helped so many women love their births, and I am so excited to bring you a workshop that will be a really helpful piece in the puzzle of making that happen. So I hope to see you there. Head to my website. Again, reminder about the early bird tickets. Today is the last day to get those, so make sure that you do. And I highly recommend the VIP ticket because I just think, if you're going to do the workshop, you may as well tap into that Q&A and get that really solid workbook as well. There's just so much value in it, so it's definitely worthwhile. And I think I said before, if you can't make it at the actual time of the live workshop, don't stress. Get a ticket anyway, and you can watch it back after it's been recorded. So there you have it. 10 things that you can control about birth. Next time someone says, there's nothing you can do, obviously birth's out of our control, I want you to say to them, do you know what? There's actually a lot you can do to control your birth. Just 10 of the things are in this podcast, and I highly recommend that you take some time to think about this because it can really make or break your experience. Let's just break that narrative down one conversation at a time. Let's get this information out there so that women know, hang on, there is actually, a lot that I can do to help me have a great birth. And again, this is just 10 tiny little things. There are so many more that we could do, but I've literally already been rambling for over half an hour. So I'll end it there. Thank you so much for listening. I can't wait for this workshop, and I hope to see you there. And before the workshop, I'll see you here next week, Monday, for another episode of the podcast. Thanks for joining us for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a rating or a comment, and I can't wait to see you back here for the next one.